Morning. Carrying on our series today, looking at the good life, and I'm going to be talking about Margot and Jerry. Now, fortunately, that kind of shows the age group in the room a little bit. I'm not talking about the old TV series. Instead, we're looking at the Ten Commandments, which are found in Exodus 20. And from those Ten Commandments, I'm looking at the ninth commandment, which is, "You shall not give a false testimony against your neighbour," or, as the Message translation puts it more simply, do not lie. And the driving force for this whole series has been looking at how we can use these Ten Commandments today to live a good life with God and a good life with each other, and how to experience relationship with Him. And as I've been preparing for this morning, I keep thinking how important Ten Commandments are for us as groups. So not just relationship with God, but how important they are for what we do with each other and how we get on with each other. And if you look at that ninth commandment, do not lie, I think that shows it really well, because when you lie, it definitely has a massive effect on yourself and your relationship with God, but actually you're lying to someone else. It affects them too. You know, when you tell them a lie, that has an effect on them, not just yourself. But before I go further into that, I want to establish what I think is a lie and what is truth. Because sometimes it can be easy to merge between the two, of a truth and a lie. But to avoid any grey area this morning, in my opinion, anything that isn't the full truth is a lie. If you're stretching the truth, it's a lie. If you're exaggerating just a little bit, it's a lie. If it's a half-truth, it's a whole lie. Because what we say when we lie can have a massive effect on somebody. I'm sure that we all sometimes lie because we think it's the best thing to do and it will help someone. Maybe to avoid an awkward conversation or try not to upset someone. Thinking that in doing so, we're actually protecting them from the truth. But you only have to switch on X Factor in those first couple of weeks to see what happens when you lie to someone to avoid the truth. How many people turn up, stand in front of a few thousand people in the studio and sing their heart out, expecting to hit the big time, make all their money and be a superstar by the end of the week. And they open their mouth and they can't hold a note. But how many people have lied to them in their life that they've got to that point? How many people have said to them, "You're the best singer I've ever heard. You've got a great voice. You're going to go so far." When actually all that's happened is those lies, trying to protect them, have got them embarrassed in front of thousands of people in the studio and possibly millions more on TV. You know, I'm sure people thought they were doing the right thing by telling them those lies, but actually the truth is so much more important, and that doesn't mean you bring the truth harshly. There's ways and best ways to do it, but the lies can have such a massive effect on what people think. And even when we talk about ourselves, and I know I'm guilty of this because I'm going to tell you a story about me in a moment, we may tend to exaggerate a little bit because we like to big ourselves up. We like to look important, or we like people to think we're funny. An example for myself, if you listen to my version and my wife's version of the second time that we met, they are nearly exactly the same, but only one of them is true. So we were at dinner with a group of people from her church, and I had a deck of cards, and I said to her, "Let me do a card trick with you." So I did, shuffled the deck, told me when to stop. Stop, she pulled out a card. "Okay, look at your card, remember it." Put it back into the deck, shuffled it, then one by one I was turning them over, and I got to the Queen of Hearts, and I looked her in the eye and said, "Because you're the Queen of my heart, the next card is yours," and turned over her card. And in my head, and what I tell people, was that was the moment she fell for me. Like, from there, it was all uphill. Now, the way she sells it is she thought I was an idiot. It's like, who is this guy, and why is he doing this to me? And she didn't even think about me for months afterwards. So one of those is the truth. Probably not mine, probably Kat's. But we do that because we want people to think a certain way about ourselves. We want them to think we are this image we portray. But actually it takes so much more humility to show who you are, to actually tell things as it is about yourself. And we know that's what God wants us to do. He wants us to show that humility. He wants us to be ourselves in front of Him. But also, God cares about what we look like to Him, not what other people think about us. God's opinion of us is so much more important than anyone else's. And that will never change. God will always love us more than the world will. But still, it can be so easy to merge between the truth and lie. And even in those two examples I've given, especially with the X Factor contestants, you can see the importance of the truth and what can happen when people start to believe a lie. and how they act and what they do. Because when people hear these lies and they believe them, they start to take root in their minds. They start to speak them out over themselves and believe the lies, and they reinforce them and over again in their minds, so that's all they believe, and they see that as the truth. We even see in the Bible with one of the most prominent people in the Old Testament, the very man who God gave the Ten Commandments to, in Moses. When you look back at Moses' story, before he's given the Ten Commandments, before he even takes the Israelites out of Egypt, you find out more about him. We know that at the beginning of his life, he was given up by his family. He was put in a Moses basket, or a basket as it probably would have been called at the time, and left in the Nile River. And he was found by the Pharaoh's daughter and brought up in a royal court. And then after that, he sees an Egyptian abusing another Israelite, and he jumps to the guy's defense, and in doing so kills the Egyptian. And he goes about his business thinking nothing of it. But very soon after, he sees two more Israelites fighting. And he stops and says, "What are you doing, guys? Come on, we're meant to be with each other here." And their response was, "Who are you? Why are you telling us this? What do you matter? Who are you to judge us? You a guy killed an Egyptian just yesterday and you're telling us not to fight." And all of a sudden Moses is just hit by this fear that if my own people think that about me, they know that about me, what will happen if the Egyptians find out? And he's so afraid that he runs away. And that's where you then find him in Exodus 3. He's run away, he's got married, and he's looking after his father-in-law's sheep. Or animals, don't actually say which. But whilst he's been away, the Egyptians have been working the Israelites harder and harder and harder. And they cried out to God over and over for help. So, "God, you've got to deliver us from what's happening right now." And God heard their cry, and he had chosen Moses to lead his people to freedom. And as Moses is looking after the animals, God grabs his attention by setting alight a bush. And he burns it without a single bit of it being burnt. It's just a light with no burning, which is kind of miraculous. And God calls out to him and says, "Go, I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." But when Moses hears that, his first thought is one of doubt. The very first thing he says back to God is, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" Now, God has just set a bush on fire to get his attention and spoken to Moses, but still, his first thought is, "That's a lie. That can't be for me. I'm too insignificant. God's not going to want me to do this." And even as God goes on and he reassures him that he would be with him at every step. "So I will walk with you. I will give you the words to say. I will perform great signs and great wonders to show the Egyptians that it is me that has sent you." But even then, Moses doesn't believe that it's God who is telling him what he wants him to do. All he can think about is that he is not good enough, that I'm irrelevant, that no one will believe God has sent me. Even God gets Moses to cast down his staff and it turns into a snake. And he tells him to pick it back up and it turns back into a staff. But still Moses is believing the lies in his life. When you look back at his very last interaction with the Israelites, with his own people, we see how those two people shaped everything he thought of himself after that. That he believed that lie spoken over him by those two. "Who are you? Who are you to judge us? Why are you telling us what to do? You've got no importance and no relevance." That same thing that caused him to flee Egypt years before has followed him all the way out into the wilderness. Despite everything God was telling him, all he could hear was the lies going round and round in his head that he had told himself for years. That he was a nobody, that he wasn't fit to lead anyone, let alone the Israelites, that it was not up to him to do anything. That one encounter all those years ago had planted a seed in his mind that had just grown and grown. And it can be so easy to be like Moses, to hear God calling you, knowing that he has a plan for your life, but not wanting to believe it. Instead trying to compromise with God, but God doesn't do compromises. He only wants you to receive him completely. Moses' whole story could have been really different if he'd listened to God from the start, and so could the Israelites as well. If he had believed the truth that God was speaking over him from that moment, and lived his life like that from there on, everything could have been really different. But Moses' story just highlights how easy it can be to believe lies. To have been told one thing, and it starts to become truth in your own mind. And before you know it, one person's lie becomes your truth. You play it over and over again in your head, and it becomes what you believe. That you're not good enough. That no one could ever love you, let alone God. No one could ever choose to be with me. And Moses had believed everything bad that had been spoken over him, and he just reinforced it over and over in his own head. And it had massive repercussions on his life. But more importantly, it had an impact on his calling as well, and the people that he was meant to be leading. But his relationship with God did grow. From that point, he did go with God. God walked with him side by side and did take the Israelites out of Egypt. But that first barrier didn't stop God from using him. And if Moses is an example of what can happen when you believe the lie spoken in your life, then later in the Old Testament, David is the perfect example of the opposite, of what happens when you believe the truth God has spoken into you. And when we are first introduced to David and his family, Samuel, who is a prophet, has been sent to his father Jesse, and he's told that one of Jesse's sons is going to be the next king of Israel. So one by one, Jesse brings his sons first forward, and the first one is like, oh, look at this guy. He's tall. It's got to be him. He's nearly 6 foot. And God's like, no, it's not that one. So Jesse brings the next one forward and he's like, oh, this one's so handsome. It's got to be him. And God's like, no, it's not that one. And he brings forward another, and he's like, oh, look at the muscles on that guy. It's got to be him. And one by one, he went for Jesse's son, and each one, God said, no, it's not him. And as they came to the last son, Samuel's like, surely it's this one, God. There's no one left. And God's like, no, it's still not that one. And Samuel says to Jesse, there's got to be one more. It's none of these. And they kind of looked around sheepishly and like, well, there is David. There's the youngest brother. He's out in the fields looking after the animal. We didn't think he would need to be here because he's the least relevant. He's the youngest. But Samuel says, no, that's the one. Bring him here. So they did. They fetched him, brought him to Samuel, and Samuel anointed him and said, you're going to be the king of Israel. So none of David's family believed that God could possibly use him. None of them believed that he'd be relevant enough to be king. Like, they didn't even consider him to be there. They didn't even send for him. They're like, it's not going to be him. But still, it was God that chose him. And it would have been really easy for David in that moment to believe his father and his brothers over what God was telling him, over what Samuel was saying. Because they didn't think he could be king of Israel. So why would God think that? But David held on to the truth that God had told him. He fully believed that God was going to make him king over Israel. He fully believed that he'd be with him every way. And you see his faith in God so clearly when he battles Goliath. The Israelites were at war with the Philistines, and every day this giant named Goliath would stand in no man's land and shout a challenge out to anyone from Israel to fight him, one-on-one, but no one would. They were all terrified. Then one day David's on the front lines delivering food to 3 of his brothers who were fighting when he hears Goliath tormenting the Israelites. So he goes to King Saul and tells him, don't worry, I'll fight this Goliath guy. God has delivered me from the lion and the bear. This Goliath guy's going to be no different. And Saul's response was, you're not able to go against this Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man, and he has been a warrior from youth. Like the disbelief that this kid, who was a shepherd and never had any military training, was so confident in defeating Goliath. He's like, you can't. There's no way you can do it. But David was like, no, I can. I will. God's delivered me before, and he's going to do it again. He believed that truth God has spoken over his life. He was so certain in what God had promised him, he wouldn't even go out in armour. Saul was like, this is my best armour. Take it. And he's like, no, don't need it. Here's my best weapons. I don't need it. I'm going with God. And as I'm sure we all know, David went out and he slayed Goliath and went on to be the king of Israel. You know, the difference in David and Moses' belief is massive. One believed the truth God has spoken over them and held on to that, and the other believed the lies that had been spoken over them. David fully trusted God at every step to deliver him from Goliath, to make him king of Israel, and he believed the truth that had been spoken over him. That his steadfast belief in God and what he had promised outweighed anything that his family told him, that he was irrelevant. Anything that the king told him, you can't do this. He knew that God had told him he could. Even in the face of what many people thought crazy, still David stood firm in what God had said. And it would have been so easy for him at so many times just to stop and think, this makes no sense. This is crazy. There's no way I can do this. There's no way God would have chosen me. But still he kept on believing the truth. But why then was David's reaction so different to Moses? Because on the surface, David had way more reasons to doubt. He was the youngest son of a not very significant family. He was not from a rich, powerful place. He spent most of his time as the youngest brother looking after the animals away from people. And it was Samuel who came and anointed him and told him that God had chosen him. On the other hand, you had Moses. He'd been raised in the Pharaoh's court. He would have been a person with significant status before he fled. People would have known who he was. He would have been a reasonably public figure. And even he also spent time with animals as a shepherd. And God literally came to him and spoke to him. But still he didn't believe it, and David did. Why was David so different from Moses? And this is why it's so important that you always read the full story. Because when you look at David in the Bible and see what he did before Samuel anointed him, you see that he spent his days worshipping God. He spent his time singing praise to God. He spent his time being with God. We know that when he was out with the animals, he was with God as well. And even then after, when Samuel anointed him, the Bible says that God's Spirit rested on him. David knew that Samuel was telling him was God's truth, because he already knew God so well, before Samuel even came to him. Every day he spent with God. Because David knew God so well, he knew his truth too. God had to set alight a bush and tell Moses directly to him for him to even listen and know that it was God. Moses didn't have that same relationship with God. God had to get his attention, set a bush alight and talk to him as David, prophet, came to him and he knew it was God's truth. And we should be more like David, spending as much time as we can worshipping God, in relationship with God, focusing on him, every day praising him, every day spending time with him, reading his word, making time to hear from him, to have a better relationship with him. I love worship for loads of reasons. But one of the main reasons is when we sing out worship, we're singing out truth over our own lives. Like when we look at the songs we've sang this morning, it's, you are good, God. You are breaking chains. Like we sing truth over ourselves when we do that. And David has spent his life doing that. The more we know God, the more we'll recognise his truth. The more we'll know God's truth from the lies. And even if you already think you know God, there's always more of God to experience. There is no end to God. Even if we spent every last day with him, we would never run out of time with God. We would never run out of things to experience with God. There is no end to what God can do. We can always press into God and spend more time with him and know his heart better. But then there's others here this morning who think the same way that Moses did. For years you've been believed lies that are spoken over you, that no one could love you unconditionally, that God would never use you for anything, that God won't keep his promises he's made, that there is no way God will ever use you for anything good, that God will never let you be whole and well again. You've heard those lies so many times and repeated them over yourself over and over again. That's all you hear and that's all you can believe. Even when someone will stand and speak God's truth over you, over and over in your own mind, all you hear is the lies again. God was speaking directly to Moses, like one to one, speaking to Moses, but still all he could believe was the lies that had been spoken over him years before. That he was irrelevant, that he wouldn't be the person to go, that God had made a mistake. But God doesn't make mistakes. And if you feel like that this morning, that all you can hear and all you can believe are lies, then it is important to know that God isn't here to shout over those lies. That he's not in here to get in a shouting match with the devil and with your lies. He's not going to shout over them because God has already won. The victory is already won. It was won on the cross. God is here to break lies. He's here to destroy them so that his truth can be heard. God isn't interested in half-truths. He isn't interested in shouting over the lies. God is here to break lies. He's here to break chains and to speak truth over you. He's here to break lies that you know that he loves you more than you could ever imagine. That because of that, he sent his son to die on the cross for you. That 2,000 years ago, as Jesus was dying on the cross, he was thinking about you. He's thinking, Jack's going to need me in 2,000 years' time because he's going to screw up over and over. Chris is going to need me. He's going to keep screwing up. Neil's going to need me because he keeps screwing up. Oh, God knew when he sent his son, you. He knew he was sending him for. No matter what lie you came here believing this morning, God is greater. God is bigger than any lie you've been told. God's truth is greater than any lie you've been told. No matter how long you've been told that lie, God has known you longer. God has loved you longer than that lie. And God is here today to break lies. I think Beth started something last week and what she brought that has been working in people throughout the week. And God is here to finish that this morning. God is here to break lies. And the band are going to come back up in a minute. And there's going to be a chance for people to pray, to speak truth over your life, to break those lies and to speak God's truth over you. And there are people here who have been living under lies for so long. Lies that have become your reality and shaped how you live and what you do. And God is here to change that today. He wants to break those lies so you can live under his truth, to know him more and to experience his truth, to live a good life with him. Now take that chance this morning to have people pray for you, to break those lies and to speak God's truth over you, because there's so much power in prayer and letting people pray over you. So I'm just going to let the band come up. There'll be opportunity for that.